We're going to discuss ecology and how science plays a role in ecology and environmental decision making. Basic definition of ecology is the scientific study of the interactions between organisms and their environments. To give you a little background, we're going to look at the different levels of ecology, starting with the organisms. So up here we have organismal ecology. This study looks at the structure and physiology, and for animals it looks at the behavior that the organism has as it meets certain environmental challenges. The next step up is populations. A population is a group of individuals of the same species living in an area. And when we talk about population ecology, we're focusing on factors that affect how many species or individuals of that species live in a particular area. So right now we're just discussing individuals of the same species and their interactions. Next level up is a community, and a community is a group of populations of different species in one area. So we have multiple pockets of species, and in community ecology we look at how those different species interact within the same geographic area. More encompassing than communities is an ecosystem, which is the community of organisms in an area and the physical factors with they interact. An ecosystem is the first level that we actually talk about both biotic factors and abiotic or non-living factors. When we talk about ecosystem ecology, we're really focused on what's the energy flow in that particular ecosystem and what's going on with the biogeochemical cycles, how are nutrients cycled, both between the biotic, the living part of the area, and also the non-living part. So what is that interaction between there? Landscapes we don't deal much with. A landscape is interconnected ecosystem, so we're talking very large scale, and in landscape ecology you are looking at how particular ecosystems are arranged in a particular geographic region. For the most part, we're going to stop right at the ecosystem level as we talk about it. Landscapes tend to be a little bigger than what we focus on. Ecology has a very long and colorful history. It's in the past has been a very descriptive science, but in recent years it's become a pretty rigorous experimental science. So we're learning ways that we can run full-scale experiments that prove some of the observations that we've made throughout ecology's history. Events that occur in ecological time affect the scale of evolutionary time. So by studying ecology and organisms within a geographic area, we can really get an idea for what's being selected for and what changes occur over a larger time scale. This is an example of how ecology is an experimental science. This is how a very large scale experiment would be set up outside. So here we have an ambient forest where it is just subjected to the normal rainfall, the normal conditions that are in this particular forest. In another section we have what's considered a wet section to see what excess moisture, what effect that has on the forest, and we can see water is being piped in and distributed more often than what the environment would usually get. And in a dry area where we're testing to see, okay, if we take away the water, what's going to happen? You can see a bunch of water troughs. They're collecting any excess rain so that we can give that particular section a much drier climate than the ambient or the wet. So we can do large-scale studies of ecology, even though you think most of the time studies scientists do are within the lab. Rachel Carson is very important to ecology and to the environmental movement. Ecology provides the scientific understanding that underlies environmental issues. So ecologists do make a distinction between science and advocacy. Rachel Carson had started the modern environmental movement with her book Silent Spring, which was published in 1962, and it really drew the public's awareness to what effect humans are having on their environments, and are those effects permanent or can they be remediated in some way. So it really brought public awareness to ecology and to environmentalism. In Chapter 51 we talk mostly about animal behavior. Definition for behavior is what an animal does and how it does it. So this is a result of both genetic and environmental factors. Behavior is essential for survival and reproduction. If you don't have the right behaviors, you're not going to survive, and if you don't survive long enough, you're not going to reproduce and pass on your genes. And any behaviors are subject to nature over time. That means certain behaviors are selected for over time, and other behaviors are not favored and selected against. Ethology is the study of animal behavior. There are two levels of behavior analysis. There's proximate and ultimate. The proximate is the cause of behavior, the how questions that we ask. So what are the effects of heredity on behavior? What are the genetic and environmental interactions? How do those play a role in what the organism's behavior is? As well as the sensory-motor mechanisms. How do we accomplish that particular behavior? What about the organism gives rise to that behavior? When we talk about the ultimate cause of behavior, we are talking about the why questions. And I like to think of the why questions as being more the evolutionary significance of that behavior. So we look at the origin of the behavior in that particular species, how has it changed over time, and what role does this behavior play in terms of the reproductive success of the organism. So the more successful they are, the more they're going to have an opportunity to reproduce and pass on those successful genes to future generations of offspring. Innate behaviors are developmentally fixed. They are not a learned behavior. This is something that your organism comes pre-programmed with. There are different examples of innate behaviors which we're going to talk through, and those are fixed action patterns, kinesis, migration, circadian rhythms, and signals. Fixed action patterns are unlearned acts that are mostly unchangeable, and once they are started, they are carried to completion. They are usually triggered by a sign stimuli. So there's something that triggers the behavior and it carries on until the complete action, the organism has gone through the complete action. A great example of this is Tinbergen's male stickleback fish. So, right here we see the stickleback fish, and their sign stimulus, Tinbergen wasn't sure, is it seeing another male? What causes them to want to fight other male stickleback fish? So what he did was he designed an experiment where they had a replica male stickleback fish that did not have a red belly, and then he had various other shapes that did not look like a fish, but they all had that red belly. And what he found was that the male stickleback that was placed to it with the didn't have
that had the red belly, so he found out that the red belly was a sign stimulus and caused the fixed action pattern for the male stickleback. So the red belly caused the male stickleback fish to attack it and to go after it. Nicholas Tinbergen came up with 4 questions that he wanted to ask about behavior as a result of this experiment. First, what stimulus elicits the behavior? So what causes the behavior? What physiological mechanisms help us to complete the response? How does the animal's experience during growth and development influence the response mechanism? What experiences or learning is going to cause this particular behavior? How does the behavior aid survival and reproduction? What benefit is there to the organism to have this behavior? And finally, what is the behavior's evolutionary history? When did it come about? Why did it come about? Kinesis is a change in activity in response to a stimulus. So our example down here is the sow bug or the pill bug. And when the pill bug is in a dry environment, they become a lot more active. Pill bugs prefer to be in a moister environment. So the kinesis is, if the organism's environment dries out, it starts to move randomly. It's not moving towards anything or away from anything. It just starts moving a lot more, hoping that it comes across an area where it is moister. So here we see that it has moved just randomly until it finally comes to stop below a leaf where there is more humidity. Ataxis is more or less automatic, but it's an oriented movement toward or away from a stimulus. So this is different from kinesis because, yes, it's movement, but this time we're going towards or away from a stimulus. An example of this are streamfish that exhibit a positive taxis. They automatically will swim upstream. That is a stimulus, and then there is a direction that they're taking with their movements.
That taxis will prevent them from being swept away, keeps them facing the direction the food comes, so there's an ultimate causation to this behavior, a why, an evolutionary significance. Migration is navigation that's detected from the Earth's magnetic field or visual cues. This is not something that is learned behavior. It is something that the organism does automatically. It's an innate behavior. Circadian rhythms also are unlearned. They are natural programming that the body has, and they occur on a daily cycle. Others can occur over longer periods. Sometimes they're triggered by differing day lengths, lunar cycles. It just depends on what the circadian rhythm controls. Signals are behaviors that cause a change in the behavior of another individual, and it's a basis for animal communication. So some examples of signals in organisms are pheromones, which are chemical signals that are emitted by one member of a species that affect other members of the species. A great example of this would be ants. When they sense food somewhere, they emit a pheromone, and then other ants can follow that pheromone trail so that they can lead to the food and bring the food back to the hive. Visual signals are another great way to communicate with other members of the same species. This could be a warning flash, such as the white on a mockingbird's wing. And auditory signals, such as the screech of a blue jay, these can signal to other members that there's danger nearby or whatever the case may be. Courtship behavior is considered another signal, and here we're looking at the courtship behavior of the fruit fly. So there are different phases to the courtship behavior. Here we see orienting, where they're positioning themselves to each other. There's tapping, kind of testing the waters, and there's also singing. So they go through courtship behaviors. Humans go through courtship behaviors too. Those are signals that one member of a species is trying to convey to another. A great example of signals would be the round dance and the waggle dance. And Carl von Frisch studied communication among bees. And this pattern right here is what is called the round dance. And when a bee goes into this pattern, he's only communicating to other members of the hive that food is close by. If they do what's called the waggle dance, which we are seeing down here, they're not only conveying that food is nearby, but they are telling the approximate distance as well as the location with respect to the sun. So here we see a bee is communicating that the food is directly towards the sun. Here, if that middle waggle is going away from the sun, that says the food is away from the sun. It's in the opposite direction. And here we see the bee is at a slight angle to the sun, and that shows us at which angle you would fly from the hive to find the food. So it's not as simple as saying that there's necessarily food close by, but there can be a lot more complex signals within an animal's behavior. All right, let's talk about learning and behavior. There are links between an organism's behavior and their life experiences. Examples of these are learning, imprinting, habituation, cognitive maps, associative learning, and cognition, which we're going to talk about each of those. Our definition of learning is the modification of behavior based on specific experiences. So for the first time in talking about behavior, we're actually including the experience the organism has had. So has to be some sort of environmental cue or something happening in the organism's experience, not necessarily just how they are hardwired or their genetics. Imprinting is a combination of both learned and innate components. When we talk about imprinting, it is usually significant to and limited to a sensitive period in an organism's life, and it is irreversible for the most part. Konrad Lorenz did a study in the 30s of imprinting on gray-lag geese, and you may have seen this picture before. Gray-lag geese will imprint, they have a couple hours right after they're born, they will imprint on any organism, does not have to look like them, that walks away from them. That's their sign stimulus that causes that imprinting. So during the sensitive period, Konrad Lorenz was the only person there, the only other organism besides the geese, and he walked away from them and they imprinted, and that he became their mother figure essentially. As they grew, they were not able to recognize members of their own species, nor were they able to recognize their actual mother. So imprinting during that sensitive period plays a pretty significant role in the behavior of the organism throughout the entire life. And we see a great example of this also with whooping cranes, which are endangered, and there's such a small population that a lot of them are being raised in captivity, which is fine, except for we can't release them into the wild because they've imprinted on humans. So to overcome the sensitive period of imprinting, humans will wear what looks like a crane suit anytime they're around the geese. So the geese have imprinted on the humans, but they haven't imprinted on what a human actually looks like. And so in this picture here, we see the human dressed up as a crane using an ultralight aircraft to teach the whooping cranes their migration patterns. So Konrad Lorenz really paved the way for what we know about imprinting and then how we can use that in conservation biology. Habituation is the loss of responsiveness to stimuli that conveys little or no information. This is very, very, very simple learning form, and it is likened to when you keep getting a text message from your mom and she just wants to tell you, hey, some mail came for you today, and then she texts you 5 minutes later, hey, we're having spaghetti for dinner, and she keeps texting you, and there's not really a lot of information that she's conveying, nothing you really need to act on, and eventually after a while you start to ignore your text messages. That is habituation to a particular stimulus. Cognitive mapping is an internal representation of spatial relationships among objects in an animal's surrounding. When you are in your room in the middle of the night and you have to get up to go to the bathroom, you do not need to turn the lights on because in your mind you have a spatial map of everything in your room for the most part. So you know where to walk so that you don't run into your dresser and you don't run into the end of your bed. This is cognitive mapping. Associative learning is the ability of animals to associate one feature of their environment with another. And this can come in two forms, either classical conditioning or operant conditioning. In classical conditioning, the organism is learning to associate a stimulus with a reward or punishment. This is where we oftentimes mention Pavlov's dog, where Pavlov would ring the bell and then give the dog a treat. So the dog is starting to associate the stimulus, the ringing of the bell, with a reward. At some points, Pavlov took away the treat and was able just to ring the bell, and the dog would anticipate getting a treat and would salivate. In operant conditioning, this is where the organism associates one of its behaviors with a reward or punishment. This is also called trial and error learning. So in this picture below, we see that the organism's behavior was to try to get close to a porcupine to eat it. That was the behavior, and then there was a consequence associated with that. So there was the pain of getting stuck with quills. And the cartoon says, watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book. Cognition is the ability of an animal's nervous system to perceive, store, process, and use information from sensory receptors. Problem solving falls underneath the idea of cognition. And in problem solving, an organism has an obstacle in their way to get a certain goal. In this case, we see the smaller chimpanzee watching the adult chimpanzee use a rock to crack open a palm kernel. So this organism, the smaller one, is learning how to problem solve, how to get through the seed of the kernel in order to get what was inside. All right, let's talk about the nature versus the nurture. Back in the day, we used to do twin studies with humans that would indicate whether it was all genetics that played a role in behaviors or if it was part nature, part nurture, genetics, and the environment. And we don't do twin studies so much anymore because we don't typically split up twins at birth anymore. So you don't see a lot of those twin studies happening unless it's by complete chance. But that gave us a good idea of what role do genes play with human behaviors, and then what role does the environment play, the conditions with which humans were raised, what roles do those play? And we found that it is a mixture of both. It's not just your genes and it's not just the environment, but both play a role in human behaviors. We do know that behaviors can be controlled by genes. We have isolated and found a single gene that appears to control the courtship ritual in fruit flies. So there is a heavy genetic component, but the environment also plays a pretty heavy role.